Hello and good evening from London. So it's really great to be speaking to everybody at this parallel session on data analytics and privacy. So I'm Steve Wood. I'm the Deputy Commissioner at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, and I'm also the chair of the Working Party for Data Governance and Privacy at OECD. So it's really great to be here, starting off on this panel. And we have 6 great panelists for you here today to talk about data analytics and privacy. So I'll introduce the panelists to you first, and then I'm going to do a brief introduction to the topic. Really looking forward to this discussion. We've got a great range of expertise here from civil society, from industry, from the legal profession, and also from the perspective of data protection officers and practitioners. So who do we have on the panel today? Well, we have Eduardo Ustarán, who is the Global Co-Head of Privacy and Cybersecurity at Hogan Lovells, the international law firm. We have Daniel Leufer, who is the Europe Policy Analyst at Access Now from civil society. We have David Banisar, who is the Senior Legal Counsel at Article 19, also from civil society. Then we have Lucy Audebert, who's the Legal Officer at Privacy International, also representing civil society. And then we have Caithlin Fennessy, who is Vice President and Chief Knowledge Officer at the International Association of Privacy Professionals, also known as IAPP. And then lastly, we have Ed Britan, who is Vice President, Global Counsel and Head of Global Privacy at Salesforce. So an excellent array of expertise to discuss this emerging and important topic here today on this panel. So before I turn to the panelists and ask for them for their opening views on this topic, I just want to set the scene really on this topic. So data analytics and how we regulate data analytics, how we manage the risks are going to be central questions for data protection regulation. They're emerging at us very, very, very soon. We can even see some of the practical implications emerging as we speak. And we can think about the scale and scope of data analytics. We know they're becoming more mainstream in both the public and private sectors, and we can see how central they are to the operating models in both of those sectors. We know that the costs are rapidly lowering. Data capacity, storage in the cloud, and also COVID has now accelerated the uptake of data analytics. So first of all, let's start with some definitions and context. So I've got an opening definition of what we think data analytics are, taken from the Information Commissioner's Office, from our own website and our data analytics toolkit that we've got there online for practitioners to use in the UK. And data analytics can be thought of as software that can automatically discover patterns in data sets and use them to make predictions, classifications, or risk scores. And we also know that algorithms are integral to data analytics. And we know that these are sets of mathematical instructions or rules that are given to computer systems to complete tasks. Increasingly, organizations are using a specific category of advanced algorithm, what we know as artificial intelligence or AI. AI can be defined as the theory and development of computer systems that are able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. And particularly the difference, therefore, between AI and data analytics is how AI can extend into prediction, into the assumptions, those human judgments, and making that further step change in terms of some of the benefits and some of the risks that we can see from this technology. So we're talking about data analytics today, not just AI. So it's important to bear in mind that opening definition I gave of data analytics. So data analytics, the take-up is probably broader than AI because the the costs and the barriers to use data analytics are lower than some of the complexities of using artificial intelligence, although that is emerging rapidly as well. So it's particularly important to remember that data analytics are accessible to small and medium-sized organizations in terms of how quickly they can deploy them, particularly using third-party systems and buying software off the shelf. I'll just talk a little bit about some of the risks and challenges as well to set the scene for the panel. So data analytics is shaping decisions about individuals. So this conference is all about putting the human at the center of our discussions today. So data analytics is shaping these decisions that have significant implications for individuals and for society, from decisions about medical treatment, from decisions about recruitment in the law enforcement field, to prosecutions. We know about profiling that takes place using data analytics. We know about automated decision making that takes place. We can also think about the different stages of the process as well, from the inputs of data, from how the algorithms are designed, and the impacts of the outputs. We can think objectively about the benefits of data analytics, the benefits for research, the insight that can be provided by using analytical software to assess data and to learn more about different challenges in society and how we can put data to public use. We know about how data analytics can be used for personalization to make services more usable by individuals in both the private and the public sectors. We also know about the importance of rights and principles in the data protection laws, which are vitally important safeguards for the challenges that will emerge from data analytics. Some organizations are citing challenges from applying these data protection rights and principles in the context of data analytics, but it's important we continue to focus on the importance of these safeguards and how we can actually practically apply them. We need to think about particular rights in the context of data analytics, the right to object, the importance of human intervention, the right to erasure, to give some examples. We know that data protection is vitally important as well for the success of data analytics. We can only build public trust and confidence in these systems if the data protection laws and privacy laws we have work effectively to develop genuine trust and confidence on the ground in practice. How can we shape fair and proportionate data analytics? How can we develop usable transparency for the public in practice? How can we use the tools of privacy by design and accountability to ensure there are high standards of data protection to drive that trust and confidence? There are questions also about when data analytics are applied to children and how to take into account the best interest of the child. And lastly, we need to think about the role of data protection authorities. So the role of data protection authorities in end-to-end regulation of data analytics. So that's the ex-ante role. What role do data protection authorities have at the early stages of the design of system in terms of the advice, guidance, and consultation they can provide? But equally, what is the role of data protection authorities to take enforcement action, to be able to audit these systems ex post as well? So we have a fascinating set of questions that I hope we're going to be able to address on these panels today. I'd now like to make sure we can bring all of the panelists onto the screen. And I'd like to turn to our first panelist, Eduardo Ustarán, to make his opening short statement about this topic from his perspective. So welcome, Eduardo. Really good to have you here today and look forward to your opening contribution.
Thank you very much, Steve, and it's a real pleasure to be here, even if it's virtually, with all of you and the audience. And we're discussing a fascinating topic, of course, that, as you are rightly saying, goes beyond those words. And I'm sure we're going to hear fascinating contributions from everyone here. So my modest contribution here tonight is from from a legal perspective, and by that I mean what I thought I could contribute with some thoughts on how I believe um, we need to interpret and apply the existing legal framework. We'll probably talk about policy, but there is already an existing legal framework, and certainly where I operate, the GDPR is very prevalent. So, how to apply and how to interpret this legal framework in a way that we can achieve the best of all worlds. And I think you have beautifully set out the scene in that respect. And I don't think I need to go much further, but by achieving the best of all worlds, what I really mean is how we can, on the one hand, realize the opportunities of data analytics, as you have pointed out, whether it is in the private sector, in the public sector, across all these sectors of the economy, uh, whether it applies to small organizations, to large organizations, and how to ensure that data analytics can lead to the provision of what I think is valuable information for everyone's benefit. And of course, information, as they say, information is power, but information is more than power. Information is progress and prosperity for everyone. So I think the data analytics can lead to that. But of course, at the same time, we need to ensure that to the extent that there are risks to people's data and people's privacy, that is safeguard, and that data and that privacy is properly safeguarded. So the question is, with the legal framework as it stands, how do we achieve the best of these worlds? And I wanted to just refer to three specific points that I keep coming across in my day-to-day work in relation to this area. One is the controller-processor relationship. And if you forgive me getting a little bit technical for a moment, I think everyone in the audience will understand what a controller and what a processor is. But in the context of data analytics, it's really important to appreciate, at least what I see all the time, that it is the processors that undertake most of the data analytics. The controllers are engaging processor all the time, but the ones that really look at the detail of the data and are able to extract value and so on are the processors. But because they have such a direct responsibility, it is often easy to confuse that role of processor with the role of controller. So I think it's really important from the point of view of those of us who are involved in this area to still understand that a processor is a processor, no matter how clever the data processing is involved. And I think that's important also from a regulator's perspective. Another delicate issue, of course, is the legal basis. What's the legal basis for data analytics? And of course, each case will have its own legal basis. But I'm making a call here for the value of legitimate interest. Again, everybody here in the audience will understand what I mean by that. And I think legitimate interest as a lawful basis, which obviously is subject to its own conditions, but that is there to be used, should be recognized as a valid ground in the context of data analytics. And I think it's important for, again, lawyers and regulators and everyone to recognize that possible lawful ground. And finally, perhaps something that I'm sure will come up tonight a few times. Of course, when we think about data analytics from a data protection perspective, and whether we're a practitioner, a DPO, or anyone else, we think about data minimization. We need to ensure that we make data analytics compatible with data minimization. How can we do that? How can we do that when data minimization is about reducing the amount of data at one level, and data analytics is about expanding the value of data, and ideally the more data you have, the more value you have. So is there a contradiction there, and how do we bridge that gap? And I think a lot, and again, from my perspective, what I'm seeing is that data minimization in this context is a lot about, for example, pseudonymization. So you are not necessarily reducing the amount of data, but you're stripping the sensitivities of that data, we can call it like that. You're stripping a lot of the information that could make that data more intrusive. And perhaps we can even go as far as anonymization, even beyond pseudonymization. So these are three examples that I could think of that are really important in today's interpretation of the legal framework in the context of data analytics. And I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Those are really pertinent three questions that you've got us off to a start with, and particularly I think the question about controllers and processes and the power dynamic, which can often get strained, I think, in this context as well, and sometimes identifying the relationships as well. So it'll be really good to explore that question and the other 2 points you've raised on legal basis and also data minimization and using anonymization as well. So I'm going to turn now to the next panelist, which is Daniel from Access Now. So Daniel, over to you to give your perspective from your organization, obviously working in civil society.
Hi, thanks. And yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here to speak on this panel. Just for those of you who might not know us, Access Now is a global human rights organization that works to protect and extend the digital rights of people at risk around the world. And we've long-standing work on data protection, artificial intelligence, and a lot of topics that are related here. My background, I should reveal, is that I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually a philosopher by training, and I'm going to do a very philosopher-type thing by starting with a definition, or contesting a definition. So, the initial definition given of data analytics was it's software that can automatically discover patterns from data. And here we're talking about machine learning. If we're talking about automatically discovering patterns, so, what systems learn from large amounts of data, we're talking about machine learning. And then on the basis of that definition, I just kind of contest the data analytics, artificial intelligence dichotomy, because if we're talking about AI in any meaningful sense, we're talking about machine learning. So, there are, of course, other non-machine learning type approaches which do analyze data. So yeah, just to do a very cliche philosopher thing there. To start, we'll get into talking about privacy protections, privacy by design, and what data protection in particular can do to ensure that data analytics is done in a way that protects people while still providing benefits. But I'd just like to highlight a trend that I'm seeing a bit, which is where things go, harms or issues go a bit beyond the typical privacy and data protection frame that we see. So, there's, for a long time, people have been justifiably raising concerns about the use of, say, crowd analytics, facial recognition, and things in public spaces. And actually, one of the tactics of industry in response to that has been to go for privacy by design, privacy preserving techniques. For example, edge processing, where rather than data going to a cloud being processed centrally, that actually processing is done. We even see cameras that are capable of doing facial recognition and different types of biometric categorization, emotion recognition, and things on device. And what I'd like to highlight is that is not actually a solution in a lot of cases, because it's actually the processing itself that's the issue in some cases. And I want to zoom in on a couple of instances like that, where even doing it in a privacy preserving way, it's still something that we would object to. Of course, there are many cases where doing things like this is fantastic, is the right way to do things. Just to start sort of as a bit of a wet blanket and say that there's a lot of very bad data out there and a lot of very bad data analytics out there. So there's fantastic stuff being done. Lots of industries are being revolutionized in very positive ways, but there's a lot of rubbish out there too. And I think just what's important to outline is that, data isn't just there, that the process of, turning something into data, collecting data, it's not a you just go along and find it. And some phenomena, especially kind of social phenomena, are actually quite hard to turn into data, and the process by which they're turned into measurable, quantifiable forms of data is quite contentious and can be problematic, if not in some cases impossible. I think, looking at one example, we were involved in a case in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, where a metro line operator was using a smart advertising billboard that did emotion, gender, and age recognition on passers-by. And they claimed to be doing this in a privacy-preserving way. They said, they made silly claims like that they only collected anonymous data, which doesn't really make any sense. But they said that, no person is ever identified. We only collect aggregate data. But actually, the process of emotion and gender recognition are very contentious. Face-based emotion recognition, for example, is rejected as having no solid scientific basis by a lot of practitioners in the science of emotion and psychology of emotion. Gender recognition, as we've highlighted in a campaign together with the LGBTQ organization All Out, systematically and irremediably discriminates against trans and non-binary people and cannot be done in a way that does not exclude them. So there you see that even if the processing is actually done in a privacy-preserving way, you have a system that is, in fact, misgendering people, certain groups of people, and it's not a random group of people as well. It's a particular group of people, trans, non-binary people who are systematically marginalized and discriminated against in other contexts. So it's interesting to see that even though we can do certain types of processing in a privacy-preserving way, that's not always the end of the story. Another point just to make is that doing data analytics is not always the right thing to do in every situation. There are certain situations in which actually collecting and processing data is maybe not something that we want to do. And I could point here to like the sort of educational technology sector, because I think it's a sector where people can kind of sense that there's maybe a bit of a mismatch. There's a whole move towards kind of quantitative education. We've seen, for example, startups doing like biometric wristbands that sort of measure biometric signals of kids, facial analysis, so facial recognition, but doing things like emotion recognition, being pointed at students, and in live time assessing things like attentiveness, and making all of these kind of inferences that are actually quite spurious and based on not very robust theories. But even if it were something that could be done well, which I'm not sure it can, the idea of sort of optimizing the classroom experience with all of these surveillance devices is, I think, something that most of us feel is maybe there might be something a bit off there. I think if we get, and just to come back to the process of can we actually capture certain things in data? How do you capture attentiveness? How do you measure actually whether students are doing well in a classroom? And a lot of it will come down to really silly things like attentive facial expressions. And if students catch on to that, then they'll sit there and do an attentive facial expression. And this is Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful measure. So there are deep problems with some of the approaches here, and I think we need to separate that out into which types of data analytics in which situations do we want to be doing, and sort of ridding ourselves of the illusion that adding data into every situation, data analytics is going to be possible to bring an improvement. Just one kind of final point to bring up is that we often hear this idea that more data equals, better analysis. In the context of discussions around AI, we hear, data protection is a hindrance to AI development. Eduardo brought up the great point about data minimization, that there's some kind of a conflict between data minimization and data analytics. But I think in many cases, there really isn't. There was an interesting study called the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study that came out of Princeton. And what happened was this massive data set about so-called fragile families, which is already sort of a contentious definition. And the researchers behind the data set held a competition to see if other researchers could predict 6 life outcomes for children, parents, and households. And these researchers were given nearly 13,000 data points on over 4,000 families. And they put to work the fanciest algorithms available, and actually, to the surprise of everyone involved, but maybe not to some critical commentators, none of the entries achieved any kind of reasonable accuracy. And actually the most cutting edge machine learning approaches with access to this huge amount, 13,000 data points, barely performed better than a 100-year-old technique that used 4 data points, and none of them performed well. So I think, there are many other examples like this where that idea that just more data equals better analysis is not exactly true. And I think it often intersects with this other thing that I mentioned of kind of complex social phenomena that are sort of resistant to datafication. And just one other thing on that is that often the very idea of predicting future outcomes based on past data, it's how we operate in a lot of cases, but in some cases it's maybe not exactly what we want to be doing, because there are often disparities between who we have data on, what groups of people we don't have data on, and those predictions can end up bringing in other sorts of biases and replicating problematic patterns of oppression. Just on the last point about building trust, I think that people shouldn't trust data analytics in its current state, and I think the industry has a huge amount of work to do to build up credibility. There are many things that can be done there. I think some interesting moves that we're seeing are around public registers for AI systems. Amsterdam and Helsinki are currently trialing a public register that lists the type of AI systems that are being used, and in the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act, there's a provision in Article 60 for a publicly viewable database of all high-risk AI systems that are on the market. These are some interesting things because, if especially in the public sector, if you're doing something worthwhile that you think people should trust, then I think it behooves you to be transparent about what you're doing. But I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Daniel. It's a really insightful set of observations there. I think particularly the observations around needing to look at the benefits of using data analytics in an objective way in terms of the evidence for the benefits, and obviously in a data protection world, how that feeds into a data protection impact assessment or a privacy impact assessment, and also really how the risks are assessed and around that sort of holistic approach as well, and what evidence we have to underpin these positions, I think is an important way that we have the right standards in place as well to address some of these challenges. Really good point there as well about public registers as well, and a really sort of key transparency tool. That probably moves us on neatly to our next panelist, David Banisar from Article 19, who I know has a really strong interest in transparency from the perspective of Article 19. So it'll be good to get this particular civil society perspective from what Article 19 are observing from the different countries they're working in and the different challenges they're seeing. So over to you, Dave, for your observations.
Thank you, Steve, and to the NI and the GPA for the invite. I'm glad to be back at another global privacy assembly. I remember the old days of the fun old days of little ones of those, but sorry it's not in Mexico City this year either, because I'd love to be back there. I'd like to step back first and point out that, we're talking about data analytics, but this really isn't a particularly new issue that we're talking about here. I mean, we could go all the way back to the Fair Credit Reporting Act in the US and the controversies over databases in centralized computer records in Europe in the 60s and in Canada and the US, and the mass collection of information. I mean, we could call it registers, we could call it data banks or big data, or whether this is data mining or data sharing or machine learning or whatever the trend is. But this is really, a continuation of a long-standing issue. And it was pointed out initially, that this is, yes, there is a legal framework for this. So we're not coming at this completely new. So I'd like to just focus on one little bit of that legal framework, and that's around transparency and accountability mechanisms as well. As the representative from the Council of Europe said earlier, it's a matter of trust, right? So if you don't have these systems in a way that are going to be trusted by the public, whether it's being operated by the public sector, the private sector, the third sector, whoever it is, it's going to eventually blow back on them. And that's one of the reasons why we have 120 countries now. Rwanda just adopted a data protection law because the self-regulation model of we're going to do this and the public's going to just accept it isn't recognized by the vast majority of the world anymore. It's not just a Europe thing. It's every continent, almost every country, 2/3 of the countries in the United Nations. So, I mean, within the realm of transparency, which is an area that Article 19 focuses on, as well as free expression, we can see those transparency elements in data protection law. Initially, there were things around subject access and basic information about how information was collected. You can see where this is going. This is the same issues we're having now. What are the data sets that are being collected? How are they being processed? Who is doing it? How are they passing it on? Later on, there were more developments around privacy impact assessments, and algorithmic transparency have appeared now in data protection laws. The new Rwanda law has algorithmic transparency in it. So, it's not just a Europe thing. This is global. But now we're at this point where we are trying to figure out, with machine learning and artificial intelligence and all these other fancy whistles and bells, how we make those more accountable. And Daniel mentioned, some of those issues already, and some of those are very good things, and I'll go into them in a second. But I think we should also look outside of data protection and look, broader into the realm of, the parallel issues around transparency generally in society. So we have also around 120 countries with freedom of information laws, and those are supposed to make the public bodies accountable on what they're doing, and that would include what's going on with algorithms and big data. We were just involved in a case quite recently in Poland, intervening where the Polish government didn't want to give up the algorithm on how they assign judges to cases, which is, a really important public policy issue. What's their decision making behind it? They tried to claim it was just technical data that wasn't subject to public transparency laws. We intervened in the case brought by a Polish group and won. So there's an example of trying to use a different kind of law beyond data protection to bring accountability to how an algorithm is being used. That same laws are being used to go after information on data collection and biometrics, also in many places. I think our office in Brazil has been doing some work on that. There's sort of things around procurement laws and making sure that the public procurement laws, for public bodies at least, make sure that information is available on who's been collecting, who's been selling the things, what are the rules behind it, who has access to the data, and so on. So, there's a lot of broader issues. So how do we get to that actual transparency? Because we know that data protection laws with their traditional rights take us somewhat there, but they really haven't worked that well. Nobody seems to think that the GDPR's algorithmic transparency elements are really as effective as they could be, and maybe some of that is enforcement, but some of that is how do we get to that? So some of them that were mentioned before, yes, the idea of registers of algorithms is an excellent idea to make them do that. But beyond just the registers of the algorithms themselves is what about the transparency of the data that's being used to taught the system, if it's one of those kinds of systems? So how do we get broader than just the basic information, the detailed information, and then the really detailed information? There's things around the risk assessments and audits that are being done. I mean, those are useful in a part, but I wouldn't rely on them too much. I mean, you only have to look at the Panama Papers and LuxLeaks to see how the kinds of companies that are doing the auditing, a lot of them are not doing it in a way that's really meaningful for the public. Yes, the audits need to be made public, but the audits need to be structured and regimented in a way by the regulators so that they're not just something that authorizes something, that hides what really needs to be made public. And then the issues around consultation. So in the environmental world, just about every country in the world has an environmental impact assessment law. And these are, I don't know, privacy impact assessments, but these are really much more significantly useful than the privacy impact assessments that we see because they require consultation. And they require, in most cases, not every country has a great law, but they require that the consultation is actually incorporated into the feedback before whatever it is that's being done. So a dam or a power plant or a new highway, it affects the community. That community gets to put their input in, and that input has to be heard. Otherwise, the decision can be legally challenged. So how do we get that into the impact assessments that we're seeing, or into the decision making and whatever is being done? A couple other elements that we should think about. One, completely out of the world, but completely relevant, is the protection of whistleblowers. So we see very few countries, only about 30 around the world, have comprehensive whistleblower laws. And especially around the private sector, if you're somebody who works for a tech firm and you blow the whistle, your career is doomed in most cases. So how do we protect those whistleblowers that are revealing this really important information that brings accountability on how these information is being collected, these data sets are being done in a way that they can feel more safe in doing it. And then finally is, an overall issue is how do we do this within a rights-based approach method? As I said, the whole history of data protection laws, especially in the United States, where it's the private sector just saying, we can do this, we're going to do it voluntarily, you don't need to pass a law, and so on, doesn't work. So, how do we move transparency, accountability to be something that can be enforced? So whether it's by a combination of things, whether it's the regulators that are doing the enforcement, whether there's law enforcement doing it, but also how does civil society, how do civic groups, how do consumer groups get involved in a way that they can usefully enforce laws that are not being enforced by the companies or by the regulators in many cases. Just ask Max Schramm's about that. And then a really final point is a desperate need to ban some practices. There has to be at some point hard law that says this is not acceptable and shall not be done. And this isn't unique. If you look back at the Fair Credit Reporting Act in the U.S., one of the first data protection laws in the world, it banned redlining eventually. Which was using information about people's neighborhoods, making presumptions based on their race or where they lived, that they were a bad credit, not based on anything they did. It was usually against poor communities. So, eventually that practice was banned. It's been banned in countries around the world. So, we should always keep in mind that some practices are just bad and can be banned. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dave. So some really important additional points there I was picking up. I particularly like the wider perspective on transparency. I think the different levers which can be used to enhance transparency. So transparency not just directly to the user, but how wider transparency mechanisms which can also involve particular groups who may scrutinize particular aspects of data analytics in more detail from additional information that's published in registers. And also, I think the point about consultation and drawing from the environmental impact assessment area, I think is important. Certainly, I think in the UK, we're starting to see more consultation in certain areas about uses of data analytics and using techniques that we call citizens' juries, where you do involve the public more about key questions and to understand the different risks, particularly from outcomes and how that can impact on different groups and sectors of society as well. So there's some really important points there, I think, about the different layers and levers for transparency as well. So that's, I think, building up the conversation nicely. I'm now going to come to our last speaker from civil society. So I'll turn to Lucy from Privacy International. So over to you, Lucy, for your perspective.
Thanks very much, Steve. And thank you, everyone, for the really interesting thoughts. Thank you to Anai as well for having us and organizing the event. So I'm a legal officer at Privacy International. For those who don't know us, we're a London-based NGO that researches, advocates, and litigates globally against government and corporate abuses of data and technology in general. So one of our organization's mottos is to fight for a world where technology will empower and enable us rather than exploit us for profit and power. And in that sense, data analytics can be a powerful tool for empowerment in that it helps to understand a lot of what goes on in the world, and it helps to structure large amounts of people, money, and other goods. So we and the partners we work with around the world are witnessing this huge enthusiasm for data analytics and AI, etc. And while we support the knowledge and the increased efficiency that comes with it when it's a force for good, I think we must warn of the overconfidence in this sort of source of truth and the impact it can have on people's dignity. So, for example, we work with the humanitarian sector quite a lot, and we know they've been very enthusiastic about data analytics as it can be very useful for the distribution of humanitarian aid. But we think it must be done right and with full transparency, and that's why we published a report with the International Committee of the Red Cross in 2019 with recommendations about how the do no harm principle, which is the foundational principle of humanitarian aid, applies to the use of data in humanitarian action. And so with this, we often warn about how data analytics can become a tool for oppression and opaque governance. And here I want to echo some of the concerns that have already been expressed. But I really want to talk mainly about the use of data analytics in public decision-making, highlighting, again, the problem of transparency. And how data analytics in that world can fuel inhumane policies with just a few examples of our work around welfare distribution. So as you all know, in the past few years, we've increasingly seen governments resorting to data analytics and other tech firms to help them make public policy decisions or administer public functions. For example, the very well-known company Palantir was contracted to assist with public health policy during the pandemic in the US and the UK and various other countries. Or companies like Clearview AI or Celebrite are often contracted by law enforcement to equip policing operations with ever more data about people. And a big issue we've seen in our work to trying to shed a light on these public-private technology partnerships is this complete lack of transparency about the whole partnership. They're often struck behind closed doors with a skirting of public procurement processes and even freedom of information requests, when they're successful, yield extremely limited information about the types of data that will be processed, how it will be processed, and overall how the analytics that come out of it will play in public policy. And even when we obtain documents, as David was saying, we see that data protection impact assessments are rarely performed. But when they are, they often lack a real proper assessment of impact on fundamental rights. It's often just a checkbox exercise. And that's highly problematic, in particular when deployed in areas with large power imbalances, such as immigration enforcement, policing, and welfare distribution. And so I just want to talk a bit about that realm. So the realm of welfare distribution is where there's real potential for data analytics to fuel inhumane policies and to violate individuals' dignity. We see many countries starting to use data analytics to, as they say, rationalize the distribution of welfare benefits. And often these systems resort to partnerships with private companies, in particular data brokers. For example, our Colombian partner, Fundación Carisma, covered an agreement between the Colombian government and the credit rating company Experian to use their credit rating database in order to make a prediction system of what they called capacity to generate income in an attempt to reduce the number of people who could be eligible for social benefits. And this resorting to data as arbitrator of welfare results in quite disturbing situations. In Quebec, for example, we've seen a woman lost her disability benefits for depression because she looked too happy in her Facebook pictures. While this is an obvious example of abuse of these technologies, the problem is these kinds of stories are just the tip of the iceberg. In most cases where these technologies are used, people are entirely unable to know that they were refused benefits because of Facebook pictures. There's no published policy that says, if you look too happy on pictures, we'll remove your benefits. We're starting to see some sense in certain places. In the Netherlands, for example, a court has found unlawful a system designed by the Dutch government to identify those most likely to commit benefits fraud by processing large amounts of data collected by various Dutch public authorities. But very similar systems are being developed in many countries with extremely little oversight nor enforcement of data protection laws or any kind of transparency requirements. And so we think these in these areas of particular power imbalance between the state and its citizens, the systems that exploit individual vulnerabilities in this way should simply be banned. As David was saying, whether there's a demonstrable public interest in using data analytics, we need strong transparency and accountability safeguards so that people are able to know why they're denied welfare benefits and can seek remedies by questioning decision making. But there are certain circumstances where these systems should simply be banned. And so overall, the point I'm making is that the reduction of individuals to data points without giving them any control over how they're seen in the world is really the dark side of data analytics that we think needs to be reined in so that people can recover some autonomy and dignity in the way they're perceived. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing further.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Really helpful insights there. I think starting off with an example where data analytics can empower if certain elements are in place, like transparency, but also highlighting, I think, some different examples of risk and how we actually need to assess those risks as well. So thank you very much for that, for building up some further perspectives. I'm now going to turn to Caithlin for a different perspective. So Caithlin obviously works for the IAPP, so you have the job really of representing thousands of privacy professionals who have to deal with these issues day in, day out. And obviously they're having to work with the data scientists and different people in organizations to try to guide an organization through the maze of these different questions. So it's going to be fascinating to hear your take on it from the perspective of privacy professionals. So over to you, Caithlin.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thanks for having me here today. It's always an honor to join such a thoughtful group of presenters, and those I'm sure are listening in, so appreciate it. As you said, I want to focus today a bit more on the people in my opening remarks and share some thoughts on where I think we've been and where I see us as headed. When we think about data analytics and privacy, I think historically we've sometimes looked at the equation as fairly black and white. We've considered all the benefits of massive data collection and analysis versus all of the drawbacks. Sometimes I think we've sat in camps that focus on how data analysis can drive innovation or ensure our safety or plunge us into a surveillance state. Certainly not this thoughtful group. You said I'll offer a different perspective. I actually don't think my perspective is all that different from what we've already heard. But I think sometimes the debate has been polarized. And I think we are helpfully and hopefully moving toward a dynamic where we recognize and can inject dials into every component of data analysis, with each dial corresponding to the long-standing and I think shockingly resilient privacy principles with which I think we're all familiar. I do think sometimes privacy is the wrong term to use in this context, and I've heard several of my fellow panelists here use other terms. I tend to think that fair information practice principles are perhaps more appropriate, or the more modern data stewardship. But let me explain what I mean here. And I want to give a hat tip to Steve, your colleagues in the UK, for some of the thinking that I think they're doing around this that is really forward-looking. As many of you probably know, the UK recently launched a national data strategy to look at how data is used or could be used productively across the economy and society. And I think it's noteworthy that the UK didn't launch a privacy strategy or a data protection strategy, though their consultation is infused with all of the principles and questions with which we are grappling today and privacy professionals grapple all the time. But rather, the consultation considers data use and analysis and responsibility much more holistically. And I see this as where our field is and where it needs to go. And so let me bring that back to where I sit at the IAPP. Always helpful to speak from your area of expertise. But the privacy profession, as I see it, grew up in the legal domain. IAPP's membership very much grew up in the legal domain. But today we have approximately 70,000 members, and only about a third of them are lawyers. So the rest are not thinking about data analysis in terms only of legal compliance. They aren't thinking, or they are thinking about data much more through an engineering lens or a business product lens, through a user interface design lens, through a marketing lens, through a data scientist lens, as you said, Steve. So to them, I think it's important to remember that the collection limitation principle, or however we want to characterize any one of these principles, is not about minimizing data collection to align with GDPR Article 5C or a similar provision in another law. It's about where data is an asset, where it is a liability, where it is useful and informing, and where it is useless, or worse yet, damaging to the organization or the individual, as Lucy very much just pointed out. And I think it's about aligning the amount and type of data collected and how it is analyzed with the product needs and capabilities, with user expectations, with the organization's own processing and technical capabilities, as well as business strategy, and with an understanding of the scope and limitations of the data as a guide. And so some of my co-panelists have shared some thoughtful examples, but I think in recent years and months, we've seen the incredible benefits of data analysis to drive innovation. COVID certainly has given us more examples than we could ever want here. Whether it's in the area of vaccine development, or one that was really moving to me was using a health data app to identify symptoms of COVID to identify that the individual might have COVID before symptoms even developed. So we know data is powerful, but we've also seen its power and the massive divisions and damage it can create to societies, as well as the businesses that control it when data analysis changes the information and the opportunities that we're exposed to. Again, Lucy just spoke very thoughtfully to that issue. And so I think ultimately it comes back to the people who are engaged in every stage of data analysis. In fact, of course, it's these people who often cry foul when data analysis breaches our own sense of fair use. So I want to differentiate this a bit from what I consider the long-standing and useful concept of privacy by design, because I think we often think of privacy by design as a process that is spearheaded by legal and compliance folks. And I think increasingly, instead, it needs to be a parlance and a question set with an involvement of far more disciplines, so that individuals across an organization are asking the same questions, and whether the proposed data analysis, not only complies with legal rules, but whether it serves the business and the individual and broader stakeholders, and how that is cultivated in the way products and services are conceptualized, engineered, displayed, marketed, and then fed back into the business. And I think it is the involvement of this broader array of privacy professionals that will lead to the types of solutioning that some of you have begun to touch on, whether that is things like synthetic data, secure multi-party computation, user-centric transparency around IoT devices, cookie alternatives. I mean, I guess overall, my sense is that privacy is becoming more technical, so we need to involve the technical professionals to a greater extent, but as we've already discussed today, it is concurrently becoming much more human. And as businesses and privacy professionals adapt to this, I think that the key is having that shared question set. Steve, you mentioned the question set that is on the ICO website around data analysis. And I think that is a really useful starting point, and really shouldn't be something that only compliance and legal professionals are starting with, but that we are bringing together a much wider array of individuals to consider those questions and together propose their own questions and ideas in response to those. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. There's some really interesting points there. I think we can probably discuss further in the panel in a minute when we open things up. And I think the points that Daniel was making as well about privacy by design and how it needs to evolve as a discipline, I think in terms of that point you made about getting the right question sets and making sure it's a joined up profession in the way it draws together all of the different disciplines, so it actually becomes more of a rigorous process, but equally not. I think it can be a restrictive process or try to prescribe solutions as well, which I think can lead to some of the problems that Daniel talked about. So I think matching the right privacy by design solution to the right situation, and also thinking about what Eduardo said about anonymization as a solution for data anonymization, of making sure organizations understand the different anonymization techniques when they can be used effectively and the risks of those, but those are going to become key skill sets, I think, even more in the future as well. So I think we can probably return to that in a minute. I'm thinking of a couple of questions, but we need to turn to our last panelist, who's been waiting very patiently, because we've got a 6-person panel here. So over to Ed Britan, who works for Salesforce. Ed, I know you've also had experience of working on these issues at Microsoft as well. So, you've worked in industry with these issues day to day, and now you're responsible for global privacy at Salesforce. So it will be great to get your perspective on how these challenges are tackled on the ground.
Thank you, Steve. I'm happy to share my perspective and happy to be here today. I'm passionate about privacy, very pleased to be here on this panel with folks that have very interesting perspectives. I was waiting patiently because I really enjoyed hearing what others on the panel had to say. And I hope it's not controversial to say that I pretty well agreed with everything that was said. There's not much. It would be hard for me to find something that I disagreed with. So thank you to my co-panelists. Thank you to Anai for leading and hosting this event. As is mentioned, I'm Ed Britan. I lead Salesforce's global privacy team. It's a truly global team with members based all over the world, helping customers, working with regulators. And data analytics is obviously a focus for everyone on our team. Data analytics are central to the digital economy, but as has been mentioned, improper use of data analytics can also harm people and create liability for companies. At Salesforce, as a service provider, we aim to help customers to manage their use of data and ensure that they are using data responsibly and also effectively. And I think that it's important to note that both can be done. And as Daniel mentioned, I don't view data protection as a hindrance. I actually think it helps data analytics to be more effective and more trusted. And without that trust, the companies won't have access to the data that they need to do data analytics effectively. So with that in mind, protecting individual privacy is imbued in everything we do at Salesforce. Because we really believe in that. With this backdrop, I'd like to discuss with you today 3 points that I'd like to raise for making data analytics both more privacy protective and more effective. Firstly, I think thanks to regulatory pressure and market changes, there's an opportunity currently to shift business practices and do data analytics in a more privacy protective way. Secondly, I'm going to discuss how I think good data management practices fuel not only privacy, but also commerce and better data analytics. Thirdly, I'll discuss how I think global data sets for use in data analytics are necessary, both to drive business and to drive positive societal change. So starting with that first topic, the opportunity to do data analytics in a more privacy protective way. Marketing analytics are moving away from third-party tracking of individuals. It's both where global laws are pushing companies, it's also where browsers are pushing the market. Fortunately, there are responsible ways to do data analytics that enable companies to get more valuable insights from their own data without the need for engaging third parties for their data. To do this, companies are going to have to shift their performance metrics away from those related to ad tracking and cookie proliferation. This is clearly going to benefit privacy, but I also don't believe that the metrics widely used today represent the best way to capture current business or drive future success for companies. Instead, I think companies should shift performance metrics to be outcomes focused and not impressions focused. So there are ways to grow data and customer insights organically in a more transparent manner. And transparency has been widely discussed here today, including by David. And I agree. I think transparency is absolutely critical. And first-party data use is more transparent to individuals because it's more expected than unseen third-party tracking, and it represents a more protected way to gather and keep track of individual preferences. It may not be as expedient as third-party tracking and the funneling of data through third parties, but it is effective. And I think that rather than getting data in bulk, there are responsible techniques that companies can use to gradually build up an understanding of their customers based on insights obtained through direct interactions with their customers. Such responsible relationship building is a foundation of responsible marketing and building trust with customers for the long term. My second point now, I think good data management protects privacy and it helps fuel innovation in commerce. Trust is important because individuals are not going to voluntarily share their data with companies that they don't trust. Thus, trust is key for fostering legal and effective data analytics. Providing more transparency, more individual choice and control over data, including through both granular and sweeping controls to enable individuals to prevent data collection and sharing when they don't want it to occur, is helpful for building trust, obtaining analytics, and protecting privacy. But even more so, Building out the capability to offer this level of control for individuals requires companies to develop good data hygiene internally, such that they know and can effectively manage the data that they control. This sort of organizational control promotes privacy, but it also fosters data protection, even if individuals don't take action themselves. So if they don't exercise those controls, which are important, their privacy is still going to be protected through the organizational measures that companies institute. For instance, I've seen strong data management practices enable customers of mine at both companies to delete broad swaths of data that is duplicative and no longer necessary, and at the same time enable more efficient and effective use of data that promotes business and innovation, because they can generate insights from data that had previously been siloed across the business. So I know it sounds like a win-win, but to Daniel's point, I think it's true. It's that better organization promotes privacy, which promotes trust, which also promotes data use in a more responsible way. And these things I'm mentioning, I'll note, they're representative of current practices, thanks in no small part to the legal framework that now exists globally that David spoke about. The GDPR truly has set a global standard. It's proliferated around the world, and I would note that standard has even hit the US in a big way, with several US states having passed privacy laws that are very much modeled on this approach that involves both individual controls as well as good organizational practices by companies, including mandated assessments of risk and impact that aren't just the traditional US self-regulatory approach, but a mandated approach to document what companies are doing in a manner that can be checked by US enforcement authorities. So at Salesforce, as a service provider, we've developed products to help customers to better manage their data and ensure privacy, because we do believe that this is the way forward. For example, we have a product called Privacy Center that helps customers to manage individual rights and also keep track of individual preferences, such as through metrics about individual consent changes or data subject requests that individuals are making. And at the same time, we're also developing data management capabilities that are going to enable our customers to have a more holistic view of their data, their first-party data, and across all of the services that they use. This promotes responsible and effective use of that data. Often, as I've mentioned before, when customers have this overarching view of their data, they realize that they have data that they don't need, or that they can stop uses of the data that aren't necessary. And obviously, this is hugely beneficial for privacy, and I've seen it play out. My third point, and then I'd love to get to the discussion. We exist in a global community, and so siloing data insights within national borders prevents the generation of effective data analytics. Now, I say that, but at the same time, I do want to note that I also believe that service providers should enable customers to keep data local. In particular, at Salesforce, we have heard loud and clear from our customers that many of them do not want their service providers transferring their data out of the EU by virtue of how a service operates, and EU specifically because this is where the concern is being heard the loudest currently. To meet this customer demand, Salesforce recently announced what we're calling the Hyperforce EU operating zone to enable our customers to have access, to have their data stored, processed, and accessed by Salesforce solely within the EU. However, even with services operating in that manner, companies are still going to need the ability to transfer data across borders in order to communicate with customers, do business effectively, and most importantly for this discussion, to build out strong data analytics that reflect global trends. So to make that happen, we really need governments to make trusted data sharing frameworks more widely agreed to across governments. Siloed data is just going to result in underrepresented data sets, excluding potentially critical data from analytic frameworks. This could lead to significant missed opportunities or even have catastrophic consequences. Diverse data sets, on the other hand, give us the best chance to innovate effectively, fairly, and without bias. For instance, it's absolutely critical that we enable the building of comprehensive data sets on a global basis to fuel the strongest analytics possible to drive solutions to global problems like the ongoing pandemic, climate change, and racial and economic inequality, which is something that Lucy hit on when she was discussing data as an arbitrator of welfare. There are ways, I think, to share data across borders responsibly. For instance, the recently released Trusted Cloud Principles, developed by the major public cloud providers, which were supported by Salesforce as well as Slack, specify important principles that companies are committed to upholding to ensure responsible data flows and responsible government access to the greatest degree that we can. While the commitments that companies are making in those principles may seem modest, the public commitment to uphold them vis-a-vis governments and to prevent a race to the bottom amongst companies, I believe, is significant. The trusted cloud principles provide guardrails, and they provide for local laws to be obeyed in the face of government access requests, including the General Data Protection Regulation to be obeyed in the face of government access requests. Unfortunately, however, obviously, these aren't issues that the private sector can resolve unilaterally. So we need governments to take action to develop global norms for how governments can responsibly access data for national security and law enforcement purposes. Such government action is critical to preserve data flows that fuel the global economy and fuel responsible data analytics. This year, Salesforce released a report called the Data Beyond Borders 2.0 report, and it had 3 key statistics. It noted that data transfers have contributed to $2.8 trillion in global GDP. The amount of data transfers is growing at a rate of 45 times every 10 years, and 60% of data transfers in 2022 are going to be digital. As outlined in the report, this growth does not need to come at the expense of privacy. As the Japanese government has posited, trusted data flows are possible, but it's going to require governments, companies, and civil society coming together to develop global frameworks for responsible data sharing and use, including and particularly with respect to government access to data. I look forward to hopefully having those conversations because I think government access to data is one of the biggest issues of our time, and it's a big issue for data analytics because of the issues around trust that creates. And so I'm looking forward to those conversations because they're going to be critical for fostering responsible data analytics globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. You've really posed important question at the end there about government access, which is actually an issue we're currently considering in the OECD at the moment in terms of how that interacts with trust in global data flows. So that is a really important question as well. And some great points there, I think, about illustrating how markets can change and can shift and how business models are changing in terms of their focus on different outcomes which can rely on data in different ways. And also the focus on data management and data hygiene and how the business case for that can support good data protection as well. So some really good points to finish there. So we've still got about 25 minutes left to move the panel discussion forward. So I've been looking at the different themes and points that have been emerging. We've had quite a strong focus on transparency. That's come out in a number of the different points. And so I think we can recognize that, but also recognize that transparency by itself obviously isn't a silver bullet. It's a really important lever and almost a really important precondition for effective regulation to have a good standard of transparency, but other things need to be in place as well. So the other thing I wanted to focus on is risk assessment and impact assessment and how it can be done effectively. And perhaps I just wanted to turn back to our first speaker, to you, Eduardo. So particularly from your experience of working with clients, obviously you've got a wide range of experience of working with different companies, and particularly noting some of the points you made about the different challenges that organizations will face. What would you say a good impact assessment looks like when you're working with a company on data analytics, or where do you need to push companies to do more in terms of impact assessment and drawing on some of the particular techniques that need to support that?
Sure, an excellent question, and I commend you for actually raising this issue beyond transparency, because the old sort of transparency, or let's make it more transparent, is putting the onus on the individual to understand what's going on. The risk assessment is all the onus is on the organization, on the body that is undertaking the processing. And therefore, in the context of data analytics, I think the key thing is to go wide and to go deep at the same time. And by that, I mean two things. Going wide is that I think it's important in any risk assessment to understand all the issues. I mean, Ed was touching on things like international data transfers, and you're thinking, well, is that relevant? But of course it's relevant, because the way in which the data that is being analyzed and the output of that data may be treated differently in different jurisdictions. So that's what I mean by going wide, to be sufficiently perceptive to the whole range of issues that may arise in relation to data analytics, and even the ones that seem less obvious. By going deep, I mean it's a really difficult bit, because it's to understand what's the significance on the individual. At the end of the day, all we're trying to assess here is to what extent something that could be good doesn't lead to a bad outcome. And in a very simplistic way, that is the issue. And to be able to, and it's, as I said, it's the tricky bit, and I'll be interested in other people's views on how to achieve that. But it's certainly much more than a tick box exercise of saying yes. You need to be able to look at from the point of view of the individual. And the final point I will make is that that's very much how we sometimes advise companies to do this, and to say, look, when you're doing this type of assessment, one of the aspects you need to look at it from is you are the individual. Is your data? What's the impact? Assess.
Thanks very much, Eduardo. So that's, a strong response to those points, and I think the importance of putting the individual at the centre of some of these impact assessments that have to be conducted. And it can sometimes be really hard to do that in practice, I think, particularly if you bring your own biases and your perceptions to certain situations as well. So how it's done objectively is key. I thought I might just turn back to you, Daniel, because obviously you were quite pessimistic in terms of your assessments there. So what role do you think effective impact assessments and risk assessments can play in improving the protection for individuals against some of those risks and concerns you highlighted?
Yeah, thanks. The first thing I'll come back to is David's point about prohibitions. I think there are certain systems or certain applications of AI that simply need to be prohibited, and Article 19 have been vocal in calling out for a prohibition on emotion recognition, which is something we've also supported. We're also a member of the Reclaim Your Face campaign in the EU, and we have a global coalition called Ban Biometric Surveillance, with over 200 civil society organizations from over 60 different countries calling for a prohibition on the use of biometric surveillance in publicly accessible spaces. I think this idea that certain types of processing, certain types of analytics, simply we need to just put a stop to, is based on the idea that there are certain risks that just cannot be mitigated, either through technical or procedural or legal safeguards. And in those situations, that's where we're going to need a prohibition on, and there can be arguments then about maybe at some future date, there can be a reassessment of whether things have progressed to a point where that can be reconsidered in relation to certain technologies. In relation to others, that isn't the case. Mass surveillance of public spaces is never going to be improvable. That's something we just need a prohibition on. Of course, we can't prohibit everything we don't want to. That wouldn't be a good idea. And then we're into a space of talking about impact assessments, figuring out what the risks are and how to mitigate them. I think we need to see impact assessments not solely as something that a company is doing, or that an authority or an entity deploying a system is doing, but as something that actually every stakeholder in the ecosystem has a stake in. And I think that's where the idea of transparency around impact assessment comes into play. It's difficult to assess all of the potential risks of complex systems in complex situations of deployment. For that reason, I think it's certainly the case that enforcement bodies need to have direct access to any, impact assessments need to be mandated. We need enforcement bodies to have access to them. And we believe that, especially in the case of the public sector, such impact assessments need to be publicly viewable by default. Coming back to the EU situation. I mentioned the AI Act that's on the table proposes this public database of high-risk AI systems. At the moment, it only focuses on what's on the market, but we believe that it should also include all of the uses, all of the deployments of these systems. Impact assessments should be done by the public sector in all cases, and they should be publicly viewable there, because we need that additional scrutiny over these to, say, well, this impact assessment wasn't done right, you missed this impact. And they need to be broad as well. We're looking at, going beyond just data protection impact assessments, especially when we're talking about these kind of complex AI systems that, in a lot of cases, we see quite problematic claims where, someone, like I mentioned this case in Brazil that we were involved in. I didn't mention actually that the case was successful, where a company that was doing emotion recognition, gender recognition of passersby in a metro station claimed they weren't processing any personal data. So, if you start off with an assumption like that from a company, they're going to say, well, we don't need to do a data protection impact assessment. So we need this possibility of different stakeholders in the ecosystem to have an overview, to have critical overview of how data protection impact assessments are done, how human rights impact assessments are done, so that they can be improved. And again, this is just a precondition for building a baseline of trust so that this stuff can be done in the right way.
Hello, everybody. Sorry, I think my my system just crashed out there a little bit while you were speaking, Daniel. So I went into 2 minutes of blue screen, but I think I caught a good part of what you were saying there about impact assessments and the limitations and the difficulties of them. But perhaps just turn to another of the panelists, perhaps to explore this a bit further. So perhaps can I turn to you, Lucy, in terms of what you see from Privacy International's perspective? Do you see any challenges or issues in terms of where organisations place their focus in terms of missing things like the inputs or focusing too much on the outputs? In terms of, I suppose, different things organisations get wrong sometimes when you're scrutinising and looking at different data analytics implementations.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the first thing I should say is that we often struggle to see those assessments in the first place. As you were saying, companies obviously don't disclose by default impact assessments. Public bodies should, they don't. We file many freedom of information requests every year to try and understand what goes on behind data analytics when used by public bodies. When we do obtain these impact assessments, first of all, they're often heavily redacted, often because they rely on the use of private systems that have been that companies want to protect behind their commercial interests for confidentiality reasons, for competitive reasons. While that's not something that we can necessarily criticize in itself, we do understand the fact that the companies need to protect certain confidential secrets. We do challenge the fact that these things are being used by public bodies in public decision making, and no one has any way of looking into them because these impact assessments can't be published. So even enforcement bodies struggle to get access to them, and it requires to appeal refusals to disclose information to the ICO in the UK, for example, in order to finally get disclosure of these assessments. And once, if we do see these assessments, we very often see that, as I was saying earlier, they're way too often just a checkbox exercise in the sense that there's set questions that will will fit what certain people think is legal compliance. But every system is very different and will have impact on people in a very different way. And actually, I think people who design those impact assessments and those who fill them should think a bit more broadly about what they're working on. And we've seen impact assessments for the use, for example, of facial recognition in certain cities, in small cities in Italy, where the people performing the assessment had not even considered the risk to individuals. So they had completely ruled out the risk to individuals, and they had completely ruled out even an assessment of the necessity of the technology. So we know these assessments are being performed all the time, but it's really hard to see assessments that have been performed in a way that we considered is truly considerate of the risk to individuals. Have we lost Steve again?
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Another technical gremlin there, I'm afraid. But Lucy, do you just want to finish your point? Because I'm sure I certainly got cut off while you were just making your very good points about transparency and in impact assessments.
Well, the main point I was making, and I'm sure others heard, I think, is that we don't see an assessment of impact on individuals often enough. This is often either ruled out or not even considered in these impact assessments. So that's something we struggle with a lot.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps can I turn that over to you, Caithlin, for your perspective on risk assessments? How can we make them effective, and where do people go wrong with them sometimes as well? What lessons can we learn?
Thank you so much. I would really actually love just to react to a couple things, two separate things that I've heard.
Yeah, go ahead.
That I thought were quite thoughtful. So in the first bucket, one thing that I think is worth paying more attention to in these impact assessments is something that both Daniel and Ed drew our attention to. So when Daniel talked about monitoring of children's attentiveness and the fact that we will drive children to simply put on a very attentive face, I think in these impact assessments, well, let me use Ed's example of talking about outcomes-based data analysis rather than impressions, focusing on impressions. So I think in these impact analyses, it's worth thinking more about the actions that we are driving our own company toward and stakeholders toward with the choices that organizations are making based on data. And I'm not sure that is always done, and then working backwards from where we are driving and saying, okay, is that the outcome that we want to drive toward, and what in our data analysis is pushing us to make that decision if it doesn't necessarily feel like the right decision. The other thing I hope folks will be comfortable with my kind of pointing out is a tension that I feel has developed in some of our focus on transparency of impact assessments and the depth in detail and critical thinking in impact assessments. And if you'll humor me for a moment, just putting on my ex-US government hat, we responded to freedom of information requests all the time. And unfortunately, what I think that often drives government stakeholders to do is to have a, what's the term, maybe a rubric where the standard is do not put anything in an email. And I think the same here would apply to an impact assessment. If there is transparency that you wouldn't want to see on the front page headline of the New York Times. And that is simply not a recipe for criticizing and challenging standard practice. And I'm not disagreeing with the need for transparency around these impact assessments, but I do think we need to, as privacy professionals, all of us, and as a field, think through, okay, how do we get there? How do we provide the transparency that is undoubtedly needed while not driving impact assessments to become PR and marketing tools, which would be and the checkbox exercise, Lucy, that you helpfully pointed out. That's not what we want. And is there a danger of mandated transparency pushing us in that direction? I don't have the answer, but I wanted to raise the tension.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. I think that's an interesting point, obviously, about the limitations or when what we might call a chilling effect can sometimes sort of buffer up, or an alleged chilling effect can buffer up against transparency in terms of how people will develop these tools when they start off working on them internally. And it might be useful, I guess, to turn to you, Dave, because obviously you've got experience of transparency challenging instances when organizations haven't disclosed things like impact assessments and the implications of that. But do you recognize what Caitlin's saying in terms of where do we strike the balance in terms of transparency of impact assessments? I think you're on mute, Dave.
Yeah. Okay, good. So, I mean, I think there's two different issues. One is the process of making the impact assessments. If I could go back to my previous point, and one that Daniel certainly mentioned, is around the stakeholder engagement. Because if you look at environmental impact assessments, which these are supposedly based on, and they've been around almost 50 years now, or 1969 in the US and many other countries since the 80s. And those do mandate a stakeholder engagement process. So they're not just a self-assessment on something that's going on. If a project is big enough, so if it affects enough of a sensitive area, or in the case of privacy, it could be if it affects more than X number of people or hits certain subject areas, then different levels of impact assessment are mandated, and those do require the stakeholders to actually engage and be involved and do that. So the concern about it becoming a checkbox exercise or a PR exercise shouldn't be there so much, because there is this actual engagement in the first place, rather than it being something that people feel like they're trying to hide. The other is, the point you mentioned, the mystical chilling effect, which, as a freedom of information advocate, we hear all the time. If we have freedom of information, then we'll get no information because people won't write it down. But I mean, if you're a government official, you're legally required to explain why you made a decision. So if you don't make that decision, you can get into trouble that way. And we'd like to think that requiring a certain standard for these impact assessments beyond a simplistic method would be very helpful for everyone, because they would know, okay, this is something we're actually taking seriously. We're not doing it for compliance purposes, but we're doing it because it's good for everyone, good for the community, it's good for us as businesses, it's good for the citizens to do it. So, I'd like to think if we upgrade those assessments into something that's a bit more muscular, then that problem won't exist. And you really do have to trust people. If the problem is you don't want to see something on the New York Times front page, it's probably because you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. That's officials are always concerned about that, but there probably is a good reason they should be concerned about that.
Okay, thanks very much for setting out the different ways we can look at the process, really. And I think, again, stressing the importance of consultation. And I certainly can remember when the ICO drafted its privacy impact assessment code of practice several years ago under the old regime we had in the UK before GDPR. We did recommend as good practice, but there was consultation and privacy impact assessments were published, and we had some pushback against that. But I think our response to that was as well that you can consult on different things at different times in different ways, and organizations will always want to do user testing and understand their customers in the private sector, even if they've got commercial confidentiality at play. So I think it's organizations needing to learn smart about bringing the right questions at the right time to the people they need to work with, so they are doing that consultation in a meaningful way. And I think Caithlin's point as well about how organizations need to focus on outcomes and not just impressions. And I think bringing in user experience design, what we call UX as well, all of those techniques can actually bring in lots of different bits of information at different points. I'm aware actually our time is nearly up, sadly. I think we've started to get on a bit of a roll actually. We could carry on a little bit longer, but it's 10:30 here in London, so we are going to have to finish soon. I'm aware, Ed, perhaps you just might like to have a final word on this question of impact assessments, but perhaps before I have to wrap up, if you've got any observations on the effectiveness or limitations of them at all.
I'd love to. First, I'd like to say I agree with what Daniel said about there should be prohibitions, and both of my companies had certain prohibitions on facial recognition, for instance, and Salesforce specifically has never offered facial recognition and has committed to not allow use of our products for facial recognition. So I think that's important. I think there's other areas where there should just be prohibitions. When it comes to data protection impact assessments, I found them to be incredibly useful as a privacy professional. Internally, it's sometimes you don't know how you think about something until you put it down in writing. And I've seen the process of going through this at companies that in good faith want to produce more privacy because we're service providers and that's our business model. We think deeply about it. And I've seen this process result in privacy by design in a real way that I hadn't seen before GDPR, because it's created a real back and forth between legal departments, engineers, and folks within a company. And those that care about privacy, we get to geek out a little bit to think about how we can improve privacy, increase protections without huge negative impacts for the UX. And so I've seen it be a really helpful process internally. And to Caithlin's point, I'd hate to see that process get watered down in any way. On the other hand, I do think that more transparency is needed. And I think that perhaps there's ways to have both an internal process that does get at the nitty gritty while also providing more transparency to the public. I will note that these data protection impact assessments do have to be presented to regulators, so there's total transparency there. But I do think that the public deserves more of a view under the hood as well.
Thanks very much, Ed. That's a really good note to finish on, I think, in terms of the practical steps organizations are taking and how they can continue to improve the way they're using impact assessments and really linking that to privacy by design approaches and really understanding how the two actually effectively relate to each other as well. So I'm sadly going to have to draw the panel to a close. So it is it's the 2 hours are up. I know we did sadly lose a bit of time at the start due to our technical problems. So thank you so much to all 6 of the panelists, to Eduardo, to Daniel, to Lucy, to Dave, to Ed, to Caithlin. It's been brilliant to be able to take this deep dive into the topic, and I think something we need to return to. In terms of some of the themes, I'll just pick out in terms of summing up. Transparency was mentioned, a number of times, so we had a big focus on that, and also, working out what makes transparency effective in practice. I think thinking about transparency broadly in terms of the different layers that need to build up. So I think that's been a really helpful discussion. I think we've had a good discussion there about the role of impact assessments, what makes them effective, what do organizations need to do to effectively link it to making the right design choices around privacy by design. I think we've learned about the different stages that organizations need to think about when they're using data, from the inputs right through to the outcomes, and how they actually assess the impacts of the outcomes in an objective way. So again, stressing that point, it's about not just about the impression, but about how you really truly understand the outcome from the perspective of the wide range of individuals whose data you may be using. I think it was also a useful discussion. I think we could have teased out a bit further about the value of bans or prohibitions as part of the sort of regulatory strategy and the policy approach of governments here, and how far that can go in addressing some of the challenges. Because I think even if you have some bans, you're still going to have a lot of risks out there that require the regulatory system to work effectively. Or do bans become a bit of a game of what we call whack-a-mole in terms of trying to always, can the legislator keep up? So I think there's a further debate to be had there, but I think it was interesting that there was quite a lot of consensus amongst the panelists about that issue, including from the private sector, from what Ed said about FRT as well. So it perhaps shows that debate is starting to move on as well. So thank you very much to everybody for contributing, and we'll close the event there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.